A push. It's learning time. Happy Easter to everybody, or should I say Hoppy Easter? um, there's a note from a minion. Those aren't chocolate eggs. There's another one for you. Now you're just somebody that I used to know. So, week off, not so much. At least for A push. Got a lot of homework. Should be fun. Alright, let's do some note taking. For some of you that were there on Thursday, then you can skip over some of this stuff because you already took notes on it. But if you weren't there, then happy writing. I'm going to go fast, so you can put it on pause and take notes as you see it. Okay. Alright, peeps. Let's get rocking. So we got the Civil Rights Movement, 1945 to 1966. As you can see in this picture here, segregation dominated the South after Reconstruction ended, 1977. Compromise, 1977. Rutherford B. Hayes became the President of the United States as Republican, and the military districts disappeared in the South, and the carpetbaggers and the scallywags were kicked out, and the 14th Amendment was used to make sure that segregation and Jim Crow laws existed. So our learning targets for this chapter here is understand the nonviolent civil rights movements after World War II through the 1960s and its impact on changing segregation laws. The next chapter after this will get deeper into the 60s and other movements as well. So both of these chapters are connected but this is the origins of the 60s movements and the early nonviolent movements. Okay, so at the very beginning, we're going to look back at things here as Plessy versus Ferguson was important. That set up this whole era of segregation in the South after Reconstruction, and he was unable to stay in the section of the train that was determined to be whites only, and so he was arrested, and this got to the Supreme Court. In 1896, they decided that it was constitutional under the 14th Amendment that you could have segregation and completely separate train cars, and then eventually we'll talk about buses here in a second, as they were segregated. Public places, public transportation had two different things in society, one for colored people and one for whites. Okay, so there's two different types of segregation that we talked about before. De jure is by law, that's actually what's written as laws, and then de facto segregation, which is by tradition, and those just became accepted in society, but they definitely were not just actual laws written down with punishments and consequences. Those were just existing in society as people wanted them to. So the origins of the civil rights movement here, you have World War II and a bunch of African Americans that are either serving in the military, some fighting, putting their lives on the line, and then you have others that were working and they were producing things for the war. So you have a two-pronged effort here with African Americans, and they're helping the United States defend its freedom against other nations like Germany and Japan. But at home, they're still dealing with segregation. So they're fighting these extreme forms of government that threaten freedom, but their freedom at home is limited, to say the least, as far as segregation laws in the South. So during this time, the United States put an emphasis on making sure that the war is the most important thing, and the protests would have to wait, and anything that was going to change would have to wait. And so let's see what happens. After World War II, you have President Truman that desegregates the military. So you have you have 13 black officers in charge of units, and then you have the mixing of white and black soldiers um, fighting and serving alongside of each other after World War II. The Democrats add the civil rights plank in 1948 under Truman and his bid for presidency, and you have the split there that leads to the Dixiecrat Party, or the States' Rights Party, under Strom Thurmond. The NAACP will grow during World War II and afterwards, and that will fight segregation and discrimination in all walks of life for African Americans and other minorities um, affected by the civil rights movement here. So before there was Rosa Parks, there was Irene Morgan, 1946. She was riding on a bus between Maryland and Virginia, and she refused to give up her seat and was arrested. And this went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court actually decided that these segregation laws on these buses were unconstitutional based on what the Congress ability was under the Constitution for in interstate commerce and regulating interstate commerce. It became an undue burden on interstate commerce. However, the problem with it was it wasn't enforced by the federal government, so things continued to do the same as far as segregation by de facto segregation on buses and trains and all kinds of transportation. Then you have a bunch of blacks that move to the north during, before, and after World War II, and so that changes the population as far as its ethnic breakdown in northern cities like Chicago and Detroit specifically, we'll talk about a little bit later, and how those become integrated within the workforce and segregated within city life. Unions began to have both black and whites together, which is an advancement there of both having the same goals, economic goals, for better pay and better working conditions. And then you have these city politics in these major cities where the rapid growth of population of African Americans changes the way that they will respond to these the social unrest and riots and all kinds of stuff that's happening in these major cities. You have Jackie Robinson, 1947, breaking the color barrier in Major League Baseball and being very good and being very disciplined and not responding to any of the death threats, the spitting upon, the ostracizing within his own team, all these things that he had to deal with. He dealt with it with grace and dignity, and he created a path for Major League Baseball to be desegregated. We have Ralph Bunche, who was a UN diplomat representing the United States and won a Nobel Peace Prize in the Arab-Israeli truce. I should say Israeli and spelled wrong. And at home was a civil rights activist as well. So you have two important figures here in the 40s that are athletic and government or politics, breaking previous stereotypes and breaking ground for future segregation to end. The NAACP and their tactics during this time is going to focus on making things extremely expensive for segregation to continue or to exist. So there's two examples here of Supreme Court cases, Missouri versus Gaines and McLaren versus the Oklahoma State Regents. And both of them have to do with admitting students, law students, into colleges that were segregated, that didn't have any facilities for segregation. So they were going to make them pay for segregation to exist as far as admitting these students, black students, into these colleges. And in the bottom one, they actually did admit the student, and he had to sit outside the classroom and had a separate area in the library, and everything became segregated. The Earl Warren Court is something you need to know for the quiz. So he's going to preside over these civil rights cases during the 50s and 60s as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And so remember his name, Earl Warren. We'll talk more about him in a second when we get to Brown versus Board. So Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas. This is on your quiz and on your test. You should remember it for life and for the AP test. So make sure you know what's going on here. Linda Brown wants to go to a school that's by her house, and she's black, and the school is all white. So they sue the Board of Education so that Linda Brown could go to that school. It is argued by the lead attorney, Thurgood Marshall. You should remember him as well as a major player within this civil rights movement for African Americans, and later he'll be a Supreme Court justice as well. And so he uses the Brandeis brief style here of using evidence, research, psychology, fields of study that would prove his case. And the first time it was used was Mueller versus Oregon. That's where it says. Anyone remember what it was? And that was the case with women, and the research done that shows they can't work so many hours because their bodies can't handle it. So this kind of research is going to be done and evidence used within this court case of Brown versus Board. One of the tests here is done by psychologist Kenneth Clark, and he does this study here of African American kids and giving them the choice to either play with the white doll or the black doll, and they continually pick the white doll, which shows a negative self-image of African Americans from their very beginnings of their younger years. And the white dolls were associated with things that were good and healthy in society and things that were fun, and the negative parts were connected to the black dolls, and so they chose the white. All right, now Earl Warren, as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, decides that it must be a 9-0 decision. And this is important because you don't have any dissent. You don't have anybody on the other side. It is 100% of the judges saying that desegregation in schools is what should happen according to the Constitution. And so separate educational facilities are inherently unequal is what they determine. Therefore, they use the 14th Amendment, and it being a violation of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. So the same clause that was used for Plessy versus Ferguson to allow segregation under this interpretation of a different court denies segregation within schools. So afterwards, you have the first one here, desegregation to proceed with all deliberate speed. And that's in quotations because that's what they used as a specific language of how to implement this into society. And so there could be all kinds of different reasons of why it wasn't supposed to be immediate or given so much of a time frame, because it's a shock to society. We would think it's normal for human beings of any different race or color in today's age, but for back then it wasn't, and specifically in the South, there was cause for a lot of unrest over this drastic change in people's lives. So eventually, the decision is for it to go for a year, for it to go into effect, and that gave time then for the schools and societies to adjust to this transformation. And it also transfers the power to enforce the law at the local school boards, which becomes a major opposition or obstacle in this desegregation of schools. So the reaction of this desegregation is the state decides to transfer the authority to these local school boards, and this prevents the NAACP from bringing statewide suits. So it's going to cost them more organization, more people, more money of the NAACP to then look at each one of these individual cases, not bring them up against a state, but against these local areas that decide to not follow the Brown versus Board decision. So some school boards then transfer their public properties to private all-white academies. That way it wasn't illegal for them to not allow the black students into these schools. So the theory of nullification comes into play here. And we've seen this before, the Kentucky and Virginia resolves. We saw it with South Carolina and against Andrew Jackson with the tariffs that existed. So this isn't something new. It's always something that's been around as a possibility of states not following federal laws. The Southern Manifesto is this group of Southern congressmen that sign basically an agreement that they would refuse the compliance of this federal law. And this is a Democrat-led movement here during the 60s, 50s, and 60s. So Little Rock, Arkansas is where this is a hotbed challenged in 1957. And I'm going to show you a video here in just a little bit. Make sure you watch the video. Don't skip over the videos because they are important to understanding what's going on, and that's the whole goal. So in Little Rock, you have a federal court that ordered desegregation, and the governor of Arkansas, Orville Fabus, yes, that's really his name, defies the court order, and he sends in the National Guard to prevent 9 black students from entering Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. So this becomes known as the Little Rock 9. And to respond to this, President Eisenhower places the Guard under federal control and sends 1,000 paratroopers from the 101st Airborne to make sure that these 9 students are protected and allowed to go to Central High School. Looking at this in the broader context here of the Red Scare or the fear of communism in the United States, and what is the Cold War policies, all of that, you're looking at it from a world view of people looking into the United States and saying, well, is this really something as a democracy as freedom if this is what's happening to their people within the United States? And so it has a definite effect on the perception of the United States in the worldview in relation to the Cold War and communism. All right, so Fabus decides that high school is going to end for 1958-59 Little Rock. So that is a pause here within specifically this one area, which then forces them to go elsewhere outside of Little Rock to continue high school. And that affects the African Americans more than it does the whites, because then those that could like get on buses or could have their families take them other places, they could still access school, not in their local areas, but they would have to travel, and African Americans wouldn't have those same kinds of opportunities. Alright, I'm going to show you this video. Okay, Little Rock 9. Make sure you watch it. It's fun to learn.
Governor Orville Fabus of Arkansas was a moderate by Southern standards, a man the black community had supported. But in his last election, he'd faced tough opponents, and he knew he'd need the segregationist vote if he wanted to be reelected. The night before school opened, Fabus made a decision.
I have therefore, in accordance with the solemn responsibilities and the oath of my office, taken the following action. Units of the National Guard have been and are now being mobilized with the mission to maintain or restore the peace and good order of this community. Advanced units are already on duty on the grounds of Central High School.
The Arkansas National Guard ringed the school with orders to admit only the white students. It shocked the country. State troops were now being used to prevent enforcement of federal law. At the center of the crisis were these 9 teenagers, selected by the school board because of their excellent grades. The first day, 8 of the 9 went to school together, accompanied by their parents and ministers. They expected some harassment, but no real trouble.
You could cut it with a knife, the tension outside the school, with these people who had come in from other parts of the state, other states. There were license plates from all other states that were there, people who had come in and were outside our school.
The 8 children and the adults with them were turned away by the National Guard.
Angela, wake up.
The 9th student, Elizabeth Eckford, had missed the call to gather with the others before school. Elizabeth Eckford walked alone and met a mob.
Can you tell me your name, please? Are you going to go to school here at Central High? You don't care to say anything, is that right? This girl here was the first Negro apparently of high school age. She showed up at Central High School the day that the federal court ordered it integrated. She was followed in front of the school by an angry crowd, many of them shouting epithets at her.
Well, it has to be the most frightening thing. I mean, because she had a crowd of white people behind her threatening to kill her. She had nobody. I mean, there was not a black face in sight anywhere. Nobody that she could turn to as a friend, except that this woman came out of the crowd and guided her through the mob and onto the bus and got her home safely.
The black parents and the NAACP went back to court. The leader of the state organization, Daisy Bates, became the students' strongest supporter. The national NAACP saw this case as a showdown for desegregation, and they assisted the local lawyers.
Well, we consider this case important as one of the segregation cases, but in addition to the fact that this one involved the appearance of the National Guard on the scene, and for the first time in any of our cases, it's the action of the governor that eventually will have to be brought into court. Then you see it as a state-federal conflict of authority. Oh, I don't think there's any question about that.
The question was whether the federal government would assert its authority. The pressure on the president increased. Defiance of federal law seemed to be spreading. From Little Rock, here to North Little Rock, to Nashville, Tennessee, and to Charlotte, North Carolina. Some people blamed Eisenhower for this resistance, saying his lack of leadership on civil rights encouraged the extremists.
President Eisenhower's position was that he was the president of all the people. He felt that his role was to talk to the moderates throughout the country, including the southern states. He felt that, and was told by many advisors, that Governor Faubus could be reasoned with, and that an amicable solution could be found in the Little Rock crisis.
In mid-September, the president and the governor had a meeting at Eisenhower's vacation home in Newport, Rhode Island.
The president thought that he had persuaded Governor Faubus to go back and allow the black children to enter the high school peaceably. It was quite a surprise to him. He felt let down when Governor Faubus decided against allowing the black children to enter the high school.
Eisenhower had convinced Faubus that ultimately the state could not resist federal authority. Faubus changed his tactic. He simply removed the National Guard, leaving only city police, in an explosive situation, as the Little Rock Nine entered Central High School.
We entered the side of the building, thousands of people out front. And we were entering the side, and I could just get a glimpse of this group. And on the car, I could hear, on the car radio, I could hear that there was a mob. And I knew what a mob meant. And I knew that the sounds that came from the crowd were very angry. So we entered the side of the building very, very fast.
We just got a report here on this end that the students are in. That's right. Turn the people down that way, Don. Down there. You can see from here some of the action occurring down there.
The three of us represented the black press. That was all, and we were on the mall in front of the school, and the word got to the crowd outside that the niggas are in the school. Then they said to us, you come out here as a decoy, and that other people slipping into the side of this building. So I said, hell no, like that, you see.
The crowd turned on Hicks and on his companions, Moses Newsom and Alex Wilson.
Somebody had a brick in his hand, and instead of throwing the brick, because he was too close, he hit Alex Wilson up beside his head with this brick. Of course, Wilson was more than 6 feet tall, an ex-Marine. He went down like a tree.
The mob was getting past the wooden sawhorses because the policemen would no longer fight their own in order to protect us. And so someone made a suggestion that if they allowed the mob to hang one kid, they could then get the rest out. And a gentleman whom I believe to be an assistant chief of police said, how are you going to choose? You're going to let them draw straws. He said, I'll get them out. And we were taken to the basement of this place. And we were put into 2 cars, grayish blue-colored Fords. And the man instructed them, he said, once you start driving, do not stop.
The rioting was headline news. The nation and the world saw unmistakably the face of resistance. Finally, President Eisenhower realized he had to act, and he did quickly. That night, he sent in the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division.
An extreme situation has been created in Little Rock. This challenge must be met, and with such measures as will preserve to the people as a whole their lawfully protected rights. If resistance to the federal court order ceases at once, the further presence of federal troops will be unnecessary, and a blot upon the fair name and high honor of our nation in the world will be removed. Mob rule can not be allowed to override the decisions of our courts.
Okay, so there you have Volume 1 of Chapter 28. We're going to do this on the next volume. I'll see you then. Alright, bye. How do I stop it? Oh, there we go.